I'm XPLovecat, and today we are going through the Australia chapter for Masks of Nyarlathotep. Now, if you don't already know, I have a spoiler-free review if you'd like to check that out. Otherwise, this is going to be full of spoilers. I've gone through a deep dive of the other chapters, which you can find in the playlist, which will be linked in the description below. Now, I'm not going to be going through every single detail because that would take way too long, but I am going to point out the most important tips that I found from actually running this chapter, and just the key points like NPCs and locations that you should be paying attention to as you prepare to play this chapter. This takes place mostly in Western Australia, however, there are 5 different cities as an option for your investigators to go to, and those include Perth, Sydney, Darwin, Port Hedland, and Concudgary. Throughout this chapter of the campaign, your investigators will get an opportunity to meet a member of the Carlisle expedition as they travel these different cities and delve into an underground city that have roots from the mythos. Not to mention, there are some pretty weird technological advancements going on in this underground city, and some pretty weird creatures too. Going into the length of this chapter and my overall enjoyment with it. So this chapter was actually on the shorter side, so it took about 4 sessions or roughly 16 hours to complete. Now, in terms of enjoyment, I would say this is on the lower end of overall enjoyment in the whole scheme of Masks of Nyarlathotep. And that's because the chapter had really good bones, but it wasn't fully developed for optimal player engagement. So I'm going to talk a lot about that as I go through this video and my top tips for how to flesh it out a little bit more and bring the best that you can to the table. Now, as always, I go through the reasons why you should play or why you should consider potentially skipping each of the Masks of Nyarlathotep chapters. So for Australia, the top reasons why you should consider playing this is number 1, if you really enjoy the City of the Great Race lore, this is an excellent opportunity to dive into it with your players. I think there's a lot of cool things and a lot of mythos background that you can pull from to engage your players and really have a great time in this underground city. You should also consider this if you feel like your campaign needs a little bit of a breather, as Australia felt more slow-paced than some of the other chapters. So it was just a little bit of a different feel, a little bit of less on the action, more of a role-play situation, and that might be a really good fit for either your group or for your particular campaign and where they're at in their campaign. And as always, if you are a Masks of Nyarlathotep completionist and you want to experience all it has to offer, then you will absolutely want to check this chapter out. Moving on to the reasons you may consider skipping this, and the first is that you'll need to put some considerable time into actually making this feel like a complete chapter for your players. So just be aware of that as you're considering whether this is a good fit for you and your group, is it's going to take a little bit of time and effort to really get it there before you bring it to the table. And the second reason, if you feel like you'd rather play a condensed version of this epic campaign, then Australia is a chapter that you could skip. I always recommend that you have America, England, and China as your core locations that you definitely have for the campaign. Everything else is flavor, fluff, extra, really cool and fun to experience, but as long as you have those 3 core chapters, then you are good to go. Moving on to my setting callouts. So the first one is that the weather here is opposite of the Northern Hemisphere. It is most likely that your investigators have spent most of their time in the Northern Hemisphere up until this point, so this may be the first time that they're experiencing this drastic shift in weather compared to the locations that they've been before. And the second call out is the climate can actually be pretty different depending on which city that you are in. So just be mindful to bring the setting and the environment and weather to life in each individual city as they're going through. The cult for Australia is unique to this chapter, and it's called the Cult of the Sand Bat. Now, one of the unique things about this cult is the lore and background behind it, which is really fun. It turns out the Haunter in the Dark, which is an avatar of Nyarlathotep, resembles the sand bat of the Aboriginal Australian dreaming mythology. And this avatar is the foe of the nature god, the rainbow snake. In general, I found it really fun to learn about Aboriginal mythology, and you can also integrate it into your game. For example, if you ever have interactions with the Aboriginals or even gossip in the different towns, this is a great way to bring that mythology to the game and have a fun experience that brings that to life. The other interesting element to this cult is that they actually almost died out before Houston arrived. So Houston was in charge of bringing this cult back to life, and he is the only priest of it. He's kind of a intense, insane guy, which we'll learn about a little bit later, but this makes it a little bit unique that he is almost the father of rebirthing this cult. They generally recruit from the slums of various cities like Sydney and Melbourne, and they unfortunately use the Aboriginals as sacrifices, most likely because it's less likely that they would get caught in using and capturing these people. Their weapon of choice is also pretty cool. So it is a club made out of polished eucalyptus that is studded with sharpened nails. Now, before we dive into key NPCs and key locations, I want to put a supplemental section here, which is my core ideas for how to improve the Australia chapter. I'm going to go through my best tips for you to expand the chapter and really make sure that your players are engaged throughout. My number one tip is to not commit to going to all 5 cities. It is quite a lot and a lot of travel in between each of the cities that just felt like downtime and unnecessary time. And so I would prefer to condense the areas that you're going in Australia. Particularly Port Hedland would be a fantastic starting point, and then moving your investigators on to Concuggery. The other 3 cities are a lot less essential, and we'll talk through details of that later. And for my campaign in particular, I did as Sydney as well. That's just because I had an investigator who lived there, so we started and collected everyone there. And I also had a little bit of link to an earlier sidetrack adventure that made it appropriate for me to use that city as well. But consider what will fit best for your campaign and some seeds or some links that you've made from previous chapters, as you might not need all 5. My second tip is a big one, and this is if you have the opportunity to grab the supplement book Terra Australis for Call of Cthulhu, it was immensely helpful. The main benefit that I got from this book was just more depth into the setting. It got me excited to run this chapter. It got me more information, made me more comfortable with what to pull from and be able to improv by having this extra information that I had digested and learned before we actually played the session. And the next 2 tips are kind of sub-bullets because they were really prompted from this Terra Australis book and is where I found the information for them. So the first is to add sand dwellers to this Australia chapter. Number 1, they're just a really fun mythos creature to include, but also they make a really nice encounter for the mine shafts and the mining culture that was happening in Australia. So having this in-depth detail in the Terra Australis book about sand dwellers was super helpful in a way that I felt comfortable kind of inserting that in an extra encounter to liven up things while they were here. And the second part is more details on the City of the Great Race. In fact, they had an amazing map in this Terra Australis book that I used in place of the map that they provided in the actual Masks book. This map was super visual, really helpful for having the different layers of the city that investigators could travel through. It was more pleasing to look at and had space for me to write additional notes that I could kind of combine the two, the book and then the Masks clues. I could combine this on this sheet of paper so that I really had a great reference and idea for what was going on when the investigators were going through the city. And not to mention, the book just had a lot of additional detail that I could pull from and descriptions that made this section really fun and engaging for the players. But even if you decide you don't want to pick up this extra book, I would recommend including some extra encounters. Sand dwellers worked great for me, but you can always flip through the Call of Cthulhu rulebook to see any cool creatures that might be fun or additional animals during the desert scenes that would be fun and mix things up in Australia. I would expand the City of the Great Race, making sure there's lots of interesting things to explore, and take your time planning this area. And this final point is optional, and it depends on what happened before in your campaign, before investigators got to Australia. But for me, it was a great opportunity to link to previous sidetrack adventures. So I had some serpent people business going on in Australia, which one, encouraged my investigators to head that direction since there's not a ton of clues linking to that area. But two, it gave it just another extra spice up, extra level of adventure and encounters that gave this feeling of a chapter more expanded and more complete. All right, time to dive into those key NPCs. The first is Dr. Robert Ellington Houston, and my favorite quote about this NPC is that though normal acting, a successful psychology role establishes that Houston is insane. He can appear suave, handsome, sensitive, and perceptive. So this guy, when they first meet, if investigators do stumble upon Houston, he will seem like a pretty put together guy. But as they continue their interaction, if there's conversation, I know some groups might go right to violence, but if there is some roleplay and conversation, he will eventually degrade during the conversation and become a little loopy. In addition, Houston is quite the evangelist, and he loves talking about how fantastic Nyarlathotep is, and he will definitely use this opportunity to try and recruit the investigators. Next, we have Wycroft and his daughters. So Wycroft is a supply agent for the cult, and he's actually not a cultist himself, but I feel like he kind of has the desire to be, because he has a can of oil under his bed where he just kind of paints on the cult symbol every day, which is a little bit sad. Like, I think I'm sad for him that he wants to belong and he's just a supply agent instead. But he's not all there either, so that's kind of a fun interaction when they likely will go to Wycroft's shop to prepare for any adventures going into the desert. Now, his three daughters are all cultists, and they were super fun to play as well, making sure that, one, they're pretty intelligent, they're a part of the cult, and they're quite engaging in conversation as well. So they're gonna likely engage and try to be friendly to various different investigators, perhaps with the goal of capturing them for sacrifice. So depending on how open and trusting your investigators are, they might run into some trouble with these daughters. There's also a little fun rivalry going on with the three of them. So I did have a bit of fun playing and trying to act out these different conversations, at once being one person but pretending like I was three. So the whole thing was a little bit fun to play with, and you might spend a little bit of time thinking about the different personalities of these three daughters and ways to make them distinct from one another. Next, we have Jeremy Grogan, who used to be a mine worker but went a little bit loopy after he saw Houston summon a monster. I can see how that kind of messed with his psyche, but now he lives alone in the desert with a pack of dingoes, and to be honest, he seems pretty happy. He is also uniquely a dreamer, so that means he can access the dreamlands, and he has the ability to create certain things in the real life environment. One of these things he created was a spring of water, which might be very refreshing for your investigators if they've been in the desert for a while. Now, something that I added to this spring of water was a bit of mechanics around it if the investigators actually drank from it. So this is totally optional. You might play with it, see what would be fun for your group, but I personally made it increase 1 hit point, however, lose 1d4 of sanity, just to add a little bit of spice to this part of the chapter. And the final NPC I want to talk about is Kakakatak, who is a member of the great race of Yith. Houston actually brought her back to this time to help aid in his work, but her goal is to get back to her original time. So she might be a bit manipulative of the investigators with the goal of trying to get back to her own time and having the investigators help her do that. So depending on how all this plays out, she might pretend like they're helping them, but end up backstabbing them once she is transported back to her own time, if the investigators figure out a successful way to do that. And the one personality quirk I wanted to point out with this character is to be a little bit condescending to your investigators. I chose to talk to them like children sometimes because the Yithians believe they are extremely intelligent, and they would think that these investigators don't actually know what they're doing, which might be the case. But it was a fun interaction to have this huge, giant, really tall creature that is nothing like these investigators have ever seen just be relatively rude and condescending. First is the city of Perth, and this is called out in the book. However, in my opinion, it can be skipped. There's no clues here. It would just be more of a travel destination stop, but I don't find it necessary to actually spend any time in Perth during this Australia chapter. Next is Sydney, and the only lead here is Arthur McWar's diary, who is the person who discovered the city of the Great Race in 1921. Now, if your investigators don't have any other reason to stop at this city, then the diary clue can easily be moved to another city. Next, we have Darwin, and even in the book, they call out that the clues in Darwin can easily be moved to Port Hedland, so that would be my ultimate recommendation if there's no particular reason why the investigators need to stop in Darwin. The main things to consider here, or if you move them to another place, is the different lines of gossip and the Randolph Shipping Company. There's a few different ways that you can approach the shipping company, but my players opted for getting Randolph drunk and then having the others go and break in to try and find some of the clues there. Now, a fair warning, in this warehouse, they may stumble upon the device of rods, which has some pretty interesting effects in the book. How it's written is their mind would actually swap with a Yithian and be trapped there for several weeks. Now, that seemed pretty intense to me, although thematically really fun. I just didn't want to go to that extreme of a measure and adjusted it down a bit. The reason I recommend adjusting it for your campaign is I feel like it's just way too likely for investigators to stumble their way into this type of madness. So instead, I just made the device give them a vision of the city, and then when they were in the city later, they had a bonus to navigating through it. So that was a cool way to give a bonus to this person who has stumbled onto using the device, but also make sure to give them a sanity roll penalty for having this weird, crazy vision that they will later understand is part of the navigation of this city. Next is Port Hedland, and here they will meet Robert Mackenzie, who can be very helpful in getting them prepared for the journey in the desert. And if investigators happen to show him a photo of Houston, then Mackenzie can confirm that they are on the right tracks. The final of the 5 cities is Concuggery. Here you have a lot more gossip that you can go into. And again, this is kind of what I was talking about it being a slower chapter and a little bit of a breather, some role play, because they might spend additional time in these pubs or getting to know the different townspeople, getting to know the stories of the miners, and really enveloping themselves in this town gossip. And the tip there is to approach your players with this gossip. So if they're not actively seeking it out, give them opportunities to have those conversations. Have the locals go up to them, introduce themselves, start conversation, have a gossip that just loves to talk to people who aren't from the city. Like anything that would engage them will help move along this section and give them several leads to go on. And of course, this is where Wycroft's shop is, so it's a great chance to interact with his cultist daughters and get a little bit more prepared for that desert journey. The Great Sandy Desert is next, and this includes some awesome encounters, so I would recommend just going to that page in the book and becoming familiar with some of those options and perhaps making up a few of your own. I ended up actually really enjoying this part of the chapter, throwing some random things at my players, but also for them getting to the death camp part and engaging with the dreamer and some weird things that were going on with Jeremy. And finally, we have the City of the Great Race. Now, this is the ultimate point and ultimate piece of this chapter and what I found the most fun to play. So my top tip for you here is to really take your time, both in planning for it, but also while your players are investigating. Just have them explore how they want to. It might end up with a little bit of improvising different paths, but really take your time in this section because it can be really rewarding and fun. The chapter outlines 2 entrances for the city, and I actually added a 3rd entrance, and this is where my sand dwellers came in. So I had some abandoned mine shafts that led their way to the great city, so that was an additional option for my players if they didn't want to get way into the heat of it right away. They could come in and it would be a longer journey and of course have some additional encounters there, but that 3rd entrance worked out really well for my players and something you might consider. Once investigators get into the city, description is your friend. Take your time with it, maybe have some pre-written descriptions or thoughts and ideas about how you see the ruins here, because it can be very interesting and a fun element to this chapter. And my final tip here is actually to not have a ritual going on when your investigators arrive. Unlike some of the other chapters where it felt a little bit more natural to have these rituals going on and a good introduction to the cults and their motives and what the cult life looks like, I felt like for Australia it was better to keep it a little bit more low-key and have them stumble on Houston while he was just in the midst of his work, as opposed to a giant ritual that was going on. This scenario had 1 sidetrack adventure, which fell kind of somewhere in the middle for overall enjoyment of the sidetrack adventures for me and my group. And also check out my detailed notes in my guest post for the Prospero House if you're interested in learning more about the sidetrack adventures. What I liked about this one is 1, it's a pretty classic ghost story, so that's always fun. But 2, it offered an interesting moral dilemma on if they were going to take care of and do justice to Slattery and have to rehome their boys or just leave things be. So there's a little bit of an interesting choice there for your investigators. In addition, I loved putting these clues together from Slattery's 10-year-old boy, so pick out your crayons and have some fun with this section. Finally, when do you know that your players are good to leave Australia? And since this chapter didn't have any real essential clues, the answer is really whenever. The nice to haves of this chapter are they are at least aware of Houston, if not have met him and ideally have taken care of him, but they also understand better his role in the overall plan during this great gate opening. And they should also have spent at least a little bit of time in the City of the Great Race and understand that this technology is essential for the success of the gate opening and the overall plan to spawn Nyarlathotep. And that wraps it up for this Australia chapter. If you're enjoying these chapter breakdowns, please let me know down in the comments and check out my recently launched Patreon page. I appreciate all the support that I'm getting, and it helps me to be able to create these videos and get them out to you in a timely manner. Thank you so much for watching. Bye.